Hey guys, I want to do a video and look at the prophecies in the book of Daniel. We're going to be looking at a lot of stuff. We're going to be looking at the 1260 days, the 1290 days, the 1335 days, the 2300 days, everything in between just about. But specifically, I want to look at Daniel's 70 weeks. This has never made sense to me with the teachings within the church. You have the futurist view of the 70 weeks, where you have the first 69 weeks beginning with the command to, or the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, its streets and its walls. 49 years later, this happened. And then 62 weeks after that, Messiah, the Prince, was cut off. And so you have 483 years, 69 weeks between the decree to rebuild Jerusalem until the cross. But the futurist view suddenly puts a gap that we are still waiting on this final week of Daniel, the 70th week, and we've been waiting for almost 2,000 years. This never made sense to me. Then we have the continuous viewpoint, where the 70 weeks is continuous, again, starting at the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, but the 483 weeks in this chart looks at it ending, the 69 week ending at the baptism of Jesus and the beginning of his ministry. And then the final week of Daniel, the 70th week, begins at that time. And in the midst of that week, Jesus is crucified. And then 3.5 years after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the 70 weeks prophecy is complete. This also never made sense to me, because when you look at this prophecy, it is discussing the 490 years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem to the time of the desolation of Jerusalem and the Hebrew people and the Levitical system and the temple that hadn't been rebuilt yet. That's what the prophecy is about. So this never made sense to me either. Why this continuous view of the 70 weeks would end in 34 AD, when the temple in Jerusalem itself was not destroyed at that time, but decades later. So let's look at this and try to figure this out. So Daniel 9:2, just for context, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So Daniel, at this point, is in Babylon after Darius and the Medes and Persians overtook Babylon. And Jerusalem and the first temple were still desolate. They had not been rebuilt at this time. And Daniel understood the prophecy in Jeremiah 25 that he was going to be there 70 years, basically. And so he says a prayer afterwards, after fasting for 3 weeks. And this prayer is a heartfelt prayer for his people, for his city. And in context, just to show 3 verses of this prayer, Daniel 9:17 through 19, Daniel prays, "Now therefore, O our God, hear the prayer of thy servant and his supplications, and cause thy face to shine upon thy sanctuary that is desolate for the Lord's sake. O my God, incline thine ear and hear, open thine eyes and behold our desolations, and the city which is called by thy name, for we do not present our supplications before thee for our righteousnesses, but for thy great mercies. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, hearken and do. Defer not for thine own sake, O my God, for thy city and thy people are called by thy name." So he's saying a prayer for his city, Jerusalem, that's in desolation, and his people who are in captivity. So Gabriel hears his prayer and comes to him and gives him this prophecy. And this prophecy is about his people and his city. And ultimately, it's a prophecy in 70 weeks, years, 490 years from the decree of Jerusalem being built again until the ultimate desolation of Jerusalem that was to be built at that time. So this 490 years is looking well into the future. That's why the book of Daniel was sealed at the time, because it wasn't for this generation. It was for a generation to come. But Daniel 9:24, the prophecy begins, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. So this is the 70 weeks upon the people and upon the holy city. When this 490 years ends, that will be the end of Jerusalem and the Hebrew nation, the Israel nation, as we know it. That's what the prophecy is all about. To finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. During this prophecy, leading to the end, there is going to be the Messiah that's been prophesied in the Old Testament. This Messiah to come will make an end of sins. He will bring in everlasting righteousness. He will make reconciliation for iniquity. This is prophecy of Jesus Christ, his life, his death, his resurrection within these 70 weeks. And it tells you exactly when Messiah, the Prince, Jesus Christ, was to come. But ultimately, again, remember that this 70 weeks of Daniel 9 ultimately is a countdown to the ultimate destruction of the temple system as they know it, and the Hebrew nation and their Old Testament ways, like the Levitical priesthood. This is a countdown to the end of the Old Covenant, where it fades away, and the temple goes with it, and ultimately the destruction of their city, Jerusalem. So continuing in verse 25, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous time. So 49 years, 7 weeks after the decree to rebuild, restore Jerusalem, its walls and its streets, 49 weeks later this occurred. Then 434 years after this rebuilding of Jerusalem, after they were released from the Babylonian captivity, 434 years after the rebuilding of Jerusalem, is when Messiah, the Prince, that you would know, he was there, and that these prophecies in Daniel 9:24 about him making an end of sins, about him making reconciliation for iniquity and bringing in all righteousness, that's when it was going to occur, to the day. And it did. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. So again, 483 years later, after this decree to rebuild Jerusalem, Jesus Christ was crucified, as we read in Daniel 9:26, but not for himself. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ, I believe, occurred in 33 AD. He was about 30 years old when he began his ministry, and he died 3 years later. 33 AD was the end of the 69 weeks. But again, the destruction of Jerusalem that was there at that time, and the second temple which was there at the time of Jesus, was not destroyed 3.5 years later. So Daniel's 70th week could not continue at 33 AD. So there has to be a gap. And again, when we're talking about the capital P Prince, the Messiah, the Prince, we're talking about Jesus Christ. As we see in Acts 3:15, Jesus referred to the Prince of Life with a capital P, whom God hath raised from the dead, whereof we are witnesses. In Acts 5:31, The God of our father raised up Jesus, whom he slew and hanged on a tree. Him hath God exalted with his right hand to be a prince and a savior, for to give repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. Again, here in the aftermath of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, Acts 5 is pointing back to the Daniel 9 prophecy. But we see after the 69 weeks, another prince. So after the 62 weeks shall Messiah, the prince that we saw in verse 25, be cut off. This is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, 33 AD, but not for himself. Then we see, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. This is not Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, the Prince of Life. This is another prince. This is a small p prince. And we know this because it says, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The Jews didn't destroy their own city. They didn't destroy their own temple. This was another people that was led by another prince that destroyed Jerusalem and their temple. This is a future prince to come. And this future prince shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. This is Daniel's 70th week. This is the last 7 weeks. This 1 week that the prince that shall come confirmed a covenant with many. This begins the countdown of the 70th week. We see something that occurs in the midst of the week, an abomination that occurs, and then ultimately we see the consummation or the completeness of this desolation. Again, speaking of Jerusalem, this is what the whole prophecy is about. This prince to come destroyed the temple and set up the abomination of desolation. And I believe this occurred, this last week of Daniel, this 70th week, occurred between 66 and 73 AD. And going forward, we're going to be using these dates. Again, things are hidden in our history. The history books, even Christian churches, will teach this as the Jewish revolt, occurring between 66 and 73 AD. But truly, this is the last week of Daniel. In 66 AD, the Antichrist figure that ultimately destroys the temple made a covenant for 1 week. Then in the midst of the week, in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, the abomination was set up. Then 3 years later, 3.5 years later, the completion of Daniel's 70 weeks occurred at the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem in 73 AD. The last week of Daniel, these 70 weeks, again, I believe occurred between the years 66 and 73 AD, with 70 AD being the midst of the week. So is there a time gap in Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks of years? I believe there is. If Jesus was crucified in 33 AD, and the beginning of the 70th week began in 66 AD, then I think there's a 33-year gap between the two. And now, briefly, I want to look at the sign of Jonah, because 33 years after the cross, I believe the 70th week began. 7 years ended the 70th week for a total of 40 years. And we know that 40 years is, in the Bible, a date of trial, a date of judgment. We see it so many times, 40 days and 40 nights, 40 years throughout the Bible. And I believe this was a time of trial before the ultimate judgment that was prophesied in Daniel 9. And Jesus tells of this so many times in his parables. We'll just look at one quickly. The sign of Jonah, where Jesus says, I'm not going to give this generation a sign, but the sign of Jonas, for his 3 days and 3 nights that Jonah was in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, speaking of his death, burial, and resurrection. But Jonah went to the Ninevites, preaching to them that their city was going to be destroyed in 40 days. We see in Jonah 3:4, and Jonah began to enter into the city a day's journey, and he cried and said, yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. This is after Jonah's resurrection from the whale's belly, that he preached this 40 years. So Jesus, when speaking to the unbelievers of that generation, in Luke 11:29-32, and we see it in other passages in the Gospels, says, and when the people were gathered thick together, began to say, this is an evil generation. They seek a sign, and there shall no sign be given it, but the sign of Jonas the prophet. For as Jonas was a sign unto the Ninevites, so shall also the Son of Man be to this generation. The queen of the south shall rise up in the judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them. For she came from the utmost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, a greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh shall rise up in the judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonas, and behold, a greater than Jonas is here. Again, from the time of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection to the completion of the 70 weeks was 40 years, with the 70th week beginning in 66 AD. 33 years of grace, 33 years of the Acts of the Apostles, of signs and miracles, preaching the good news of Christ before these prophecies were to be fulfilled. So let's get to the prince that shall come. He began his rule in 66 AD. Or he, at least if he was in power before then, he began this 1 week covenant, which began the 70 weeks in 66 AD. In Daniel 11:23 it says, speaking of this prince to come, and after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. And I think this is speaking of the unbelieving Jewish leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees. I think they were in league together. And that this covenant that was made was a covenant for the land, that they could continue within the Roman Empire to continue their sacrificial system, their Levitical priesthood system, and all the things and the land that they were promised to be heirs of. Says here, the first Jewish-Roman war in 66 AD. Again, there was war, and there was war that involved Jews and Romans, but it was against Christians. This is the beginning of the tribulation. The great tribulation that we see in the Bible began in earnest in 66 AD at the hand of the Roman Empire, who slaughtered Christians. but also the continuation of Jewish persecution. As we read in Matthew 10:17, but beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils, and they will scourge you in their synagogues. This is not speaking of the Romans. This is the great tribulation that is spoken of in the Bible, and it occurred in the first 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week, between the years 66 and 70 A.D. Continuing in Daniel 11:30, for the ships of Shittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. So this covenant that he made with many for 1 week, I believe with the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders to continue their way of life, that he suddenly had a change of heart. And I think this was an inside job. I think that there were Jewish leaders that conspired against their own people and made league with the Roman Empire, specifically this leader, this Antichrist figure. And when that occurred at the midst of the week, then this is where you see in the Gospels to get out of there. It says in Luke 21:20, and when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. The desolation of the temple and the setting up of the abomination of desolation to stand where it ought not in the holy place. When you see this happen, when you see a empire and their army surrounding Jerusalem, then get out of there. And this is what happened in 70 A.D. in the midst of the week. We look at it as the siege of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., the great Jewish revolt. This is the Romans and those that were in league with them turning over the Levitical system and the temple to the Romans, who ultimately destroyed it at that time. Daniel 11:31, an arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. The abomination of desolation occurred in the midst of the week. It was placed at this time after Jerusalem was compassed by armies, and ultimately the temple was overtaken by the Roman Empire and its leader. And this is what I think the abomination of desolation that was set up looked like. Again, Rome set it up. Their god, Apollo, who we see in New York Harbor today. The more things change, the more it stays the same. But continuing, when Jesus in his prophecies tells them, when you see the abomination set up, then get out of there, get out of Jerusalem. In Luke 21:21, then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. Because it's going down now. All of it's going down. Think about when Lot was told to get out of Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, get out of there. That's why in the Gospels, when it speaks of this time, it says, remember Lot's wife. Don't go back in there, because it's about to be destroyed. So if our old maps of the Old Testament are correct, we'll use it until I see otherwise, even though I doubt this is exactly how it looked back then. But if we see Jerusalem here, flee to the mountains, flee to Ammon, Moab, Edom, flee to this area, get out of here. This is going to become soon, very soon, Sodom and Gomorrah-like. Daniel 11:41. Still, continuing to speak about this time period, about this prince that shall come, that destroys the sanctuary and the city. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. That's why Jesus told him to go there, because he wasn't going to be able to get to them there. The light in Goshen. This is the preservation of those who followed those commandments, who believed in the Messiah, Jesus Christ, and trusted the word of God and these prophecies. They got out of there and they were protected, just like the Israelites were protected in Goshen at the time of the Exodus plagues in Egypt. And we see this in Revelation 12:6 and 14. In 12:6, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. From the time that that Jerusalem was compassed by the armies in the midst of the week, that was 1,260 days after the 1 week covenant began. Then the second half, 1,260 days, the second half of the 3.5 years, when everything is really going down, that we're going to see here soon, the people that fled to the mountains were protected during this time. And we see it in Revelation 12:14. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into a place where she is nourished for a time and times and half times. Same languages the book of Daniel was using, from the face of the serpent. And speaking of this language, this 3.5 years, this 1,260 days, this 42 months, this times and half time. Basically, the book of Revelation is a book that was open. It was not sealed, because the time was at hand. The time was near. All these things must shortly come to pass. That was written in the book of Revelation. The book of Daniel was looking at this far as several hundred years, and in the prophecies go over the different empires that were stepping stones to this ultimate time that we see in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation expounds on these final end times for that generation prophecy and discusses these 3.5 years extensively. So when was the book of Revelation written? I think it was obviously written before all this went down, before 70 AD, definitely, before the abomination of desolation. And I feel like it was actually written after the tribulation just started, after the Antichrist figure, the prince that shall come, that was ultimately going to destroy the sanctuary in the city. I believe that the book of Revelation was written right after this 70 weeks began in 66 AD, when the Christian persecution really ramped up. And we see this because John was in prison when he wrote it. John, in verse 9, and this is after verse 1, it says, these are things which shortly must come to pass. In verse 3, the time is at hand. In verse 7, that every eye shall see him, also them which pierced him. Then in verse 9, I, John, who also am your brother and companion in tribulation and in the kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ. So I think that the book of Revelation was given at the beginning of this tribulation in 66 AD, possibly even into 67 AD, before it got throughout the 7 churches and then spread abroad to the Christians throughout the Roman Empire. But it was given enough time for everybody to know what was to occur. Again, in Daniel 12:9, it says, go thy way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed till the time of the end. But in Revelation 22:10, it says, and he said to me, seal not the sayings of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand. So this was written to that generation for this imminent destruction that was about to come. Not only was the book of Revelation written, but the book of Romans was written also as a warning. And so was the book of Hebrews. So during this time in the early 60s, just a few years before the abomination of desolation was set up, and ultimately the destruction of Jerusalem in 73 AD and the fall of Rome there or shortly thereafter. We see the book of Hebrews as a warning of these things to come for the Hebrew nation, written to the Israelites. We see the book of Romans written to the Roman Empire for the Jews and Gentiles alike who were there, of all these things that were about to come down upon them. And then we see in the book of Revelation, it written to the Gentile churches, the believers of things. All these three books, this trinity of end times books for these three specific groups of people: the believing Christians, the Romans within the Roman Empire, of believers, of non-believers, of Jews, of Gentiles, and then the Hebrew nation itself. So the 1260, 1290, and 1335 days that we see in prophecy, what's all that about? Well, the 1260 days are divided in half for 3.5 years. 1260 on the front, 1260 on the back. The first 1260 days is the Christian persecution. This is the Great Tribulation that was carried out by the Romans and the Jews. And we see this several times in the book of Revelation. The harlot and the beast. This is the Jewish nation that was in league, the unbelieving rulers of the Jewish people in league with the Roman Empire. But then we see in Daniel 12:11, and from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. So I believe 1,260 days, the halfway point in the midst of the week, I think that Jerusalem was surrounded, compassed by armies, and that the temple was ransacked. And for 1 month, 30 days, ultimately 1,290 days after this prophecy had begun, that's when the abomination of desolation was set up. And again, I think that's what it looked like. The abomination of desolation set up 1,290 days into Daniel's 70th week. Another reference to 42 months, Revelation 11:2, but the court which is without the temple leave out and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. Now, in Revelation 11:2, this is getting well within the trumpet judgments. This is speaking of the second 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. And this is when we see the two witnesses. In Revelation 11:3, and I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,203 score days, clothed in sackcloth. So I think the two witnesses' ministry began at the time of the midpoint, ending at the completion of Daniel's 70th week. It began when Jerusalem was compassed by armies. Now, who they were, we can speculate. I think one was probably John, because we see at the end of Revelation 10 where he commands John that he's going to go out and start, speaking to all tongues and nations. And then we begin verse 11 or chapter 11, and we see the beginning of the two witnesses being mentioned. So it could be John. I think it was apostles who were alive at that time, whoever they may be. It may be Paul, maybe Peter, but I do think it was 2 of the 12 apostles that were ultimately the two witnesses. And it doesn't really matter, that we know who they were. But that's my thoughts on it. Daniel 12:12. Blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1,305 and 30 days. So 1,335 days into Daniel's 70th week. This is 75 days after the midpoint, 45 days after the abomination of desolation is set up. Another event happens, and those who experience this event are blessed. What is this event? I believe this is when the sixth seal was unsealed, and that was Jesus coming in the clouds, and this is the timing of the first resurrection and the gathering of the saints, those that were alive and remained at that time. Believers were taken in the clouds with Jesus at that time after the first resurrection at this 1335-day period. And we see this after the 144,000 are sealed in Revelation 7, prior to the beginning of the trumpet judgments in Revelation 8. The trumpet judgments are part of the second 1260 days, and I think they occurred actually right after the first resurrection and the rapture. There was the seventh seal after that, a space of 30 minutes, a time of grace that occurred, and then the trumpet judgments occurred. I think the trumpet judgments occurred the second half of Daniel's 70th week within the years 70 to 73 AD. Ultimately, with the seventh trumpet showing the destruction of Jerusalem and the Roman Empire, or at least part of it. In Daniel 11:36, and the king shall do according to his will, and shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Again, what is to be determined, this indignation to be accomplished, is the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem in 73 AD, 7 years after 66 AD, when this final week of Daniel's 70 week began. And this again is speaking of the prince that shall come, this Antichrist figure. Revelation 13:5, and there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. So he began 42 months earlier, and then after Jerusalem being encompassed by the armies, ultimately the abomination of desolation being set up, and then the first resurrection, the rapture event, the trumpet judgments start, and he continued during these 42 months between 70 and 73 AD during this time of trumpet judgments. In this trumpet judgments, again, we see the two witnesses during the same period of time calling out all plagues as often as they will. This is part of these trumpet judgments. And again, it shadows types from Exodus, from Aaron and Moses being two witnesses. As God carried out these plagues on Pharaoh and the Egyptians, same thing is occurring here. Exodus is a shadow of this end times event. Ultimately, the fall of Jerusalem occurred in 73 AD at the end of Daniel's 70th week. But also, the fall of Rome occurred with these trumpet judgments. And what wasn't finished off by the trumpet judgments within the Roman Empire, the vial judgments got. But this judgment, ultimately, of Jerusalem, destruction of Jerusalem and fall of Rome, ultimately was a prophecy fulfilled of Daniel 2 and Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel's interpretation thereof, of the statue where the feet of iron and miry clay, the Roman Empire, and the Hebrew nation, the Israelites, the Jewish people, Jerusalem, were destroyed together. And we see this in the book of Revelation, that they were destroyed together. And so what's the 2300-day prophecy? So we've gone through a lot of different things on the 1260 days, so 3.5 years, both sides of it, the first half, the second half. Talked about the 1290 days being the 30 days after Jerusalem was surrounded by armies that the abomination of desolation was actually set up. And then the 1335 days, so 45 days later after the abomination of desolation was set up, that is when the sixth seal was opened. That's when the first resurrection and the rapture occurred. So the 2300-day prophecy, this is my interpretation of this. And we see this in Daniel 8, 13, and 14. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said to me, To 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So I think this 2,300 days is also part of this prophecy that began with Daniel's 70th week, but it's a continuation past it. So Daniel's 70th week ended in 73 AD. The abomination of desolation and where the sanctuary was desecrated was in 70 AD. So this 2300 day prophecy began at the time that the abomination of desolation was set up. So 2300 days after that would be a little over 6 years and 2 or 3 months afterwards. So ultimately, the sanctuary was cleansed in 76 AD. And so I think ultimately that is when the world was judged during this end times event. And afterwards, the stone that broke the feet of iron and miry clay, the fall of Rome, the destruction of Jerusalem, that stone, Jesus Christ, filled the earth, became a great mountain. This cleansing of the sanctuary that occurred and began in 76 AD, after the end of the judgments that we see in the book of Revelation, with the 7 vials, I believe being a continuation of this judgment on the Roman Empire and ultimately the world. I believe the 7 vials occurred at this time after the 73 AD. I think these final 7 vials began from 73 to 76 AD until ultimately the sanctuary was cleansed. After this destruction that we read about in the Old and New Testament in 2 Peter 3:11 through 12, seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation and godliness, looking for and hastening unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. I think this was the end of the 2300-day prophecy occurring at 76 AD after the vial judgments. And this ushered in the cleansing of the sanctuary in 2 Peter 3:13. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness. And this new heavens and new earth that began at that time was the millennial kingdom of Christ. His millennial reign, a literal 1,000 years, began. This was the stone, Jesus Christ, that filled the world, became a great mountain and filled the world. So this eschatology that you see here that we just looked at, looking at Daniel, looking at the book of Revelation, specifically using Daniel's 70 weeks as a guide, this is not preterism. This is little season eschatology. This is the most valid end times eschatology viewpoint that I've ever studied, and it only gets more and more solid as we study this out. So we're going to continue to do this. Thanks for hanging out. God bless.